Splatoon 3 is still in development and I'm pretty excited for it, but this game has actually become fairly controversial because of how similar it looks to previous entries in the series. So in this video we're going to be doing a deep dive into the visuals of this game with a focus on the very specific choices that the artists have made, and along the way we're going to be comparing these elements to Splatoon 1 and 2 to see what's changed and what hasn't. And actually, there's some really interesting stuff in here that I haven't seen anyone else mention yet. We're going to get to these brand new specials and inky explosions in a minute, but first let's start at the start. Or before the start even. The loading screen before a match of Splatoon is pretty iconic. If you've played the game, I'm sure you can even hear this image. Nintendo clearly understands this and decided to include the loading screen into the trailer, giving us a look at the new redesign. The animation itself is similar to Splatoon 2, but for the first time it's completely in 3D. I love the way it quickly spins to flick that drop of ink into the air before catching it. It's very satisfying to watch. It also rotates now, adding a little bit more interesting movement. In comparison, Splatoon 2's was a very similar concept, just in 2D, and Splatoon 1's loading screen was pretty bad, to be honest. The animation really lacks the energy or interesting shapes of the newer games. By the way, did you notice the colors of the loading icon in Splatoon 2 were based on the colors of the logo? It's the same here in Splatoon 3, presumably. It's also possible at this point that the loading screen colors are based on the teams that are about to play, although it's probably just based on the game's logo. Moving forwards, the classic squid icon opening up the game returns, completely unchanged since Splatoon 1. I still like it though. In most situations when opening to a new scene, the camera will simply fade in, but this animation adds a lot more personality. Personally, it feels very Nintendo to me as well, since it's similar to that animation in Super Mario 64. Also note how it fades out as it gets bigger to really smooth out that transition. In usual fashion, the game mode is made clear to you right at the start. This game is mostly very colourful, but the use of black and white here makes sure this important information has a very strong contrast and is easy to quickly read. Compared to Splatoon 2, the splat graphic has a lot more impact and texture here, making the old one feel very boring and uniform in comparison. A little texture goes a really long way to give these UI elements a lot more personality. The word mode is changed to rules here, although keep in mind that's very likely an asset from the Japanese version that they haven't translated yet. And due to a very strange design choice I'll show you in a minute, it's clear they haven't actually finished translating this game yet by the time this trailer came out. The text here is given a new black background, which again really helps add contrast and makes it easier to read. What's really cool here is how different the camera movement is this time. In the older games it's very slow, and in Splatoon 2 specifically it really doesn't show you anything you won't see when you're playing. In Splatoon 3 it quickly zooms up to give you a great view of the stage. Fading into such a quick camera movement really makes the scene more exciting. It's very attention grabbing right from the start. Also, I just want to note how boring and basic the Splatoon 1 UI is here. I really love this game, but man, this does not hold up that well. The player tags then load in from the side, which are a great way to give the players more personality with how they're represented. This also means it's easier to immediately see who is on what team, whereas this was a little bit awkward in the previous games. Considering Splatoon has always locked you into one mode and two maps anyway, it's nice to see the screen have some more interesting information that will change each match. We then fade to white to cut to the Inkling introduction. There's a random black frame here and quite an abrupt cut, which makes me think this footage has probably been edited. The older games fade to white in the exact same way, but it's a completely smooth transition. What's a little more interesting than a single black frame though, is these new animations. There's a surprising amount of movement with these espresso machines, as they all fly into frame one at a time. In the older games, Inklings will just play the same animation at pretty much the same time, but everyone's given their own spotlights here, and doing this helps mask the same animations being used on multiple characters. The same goes for the players' name tags. Everyone is introduced smoothly here, rather than all four names being thrown at you suddenly before quickly cutting away. If you're trying to pay attention to who you're playing with, this could definitely make the experience a lot better. And by the way, giving each Inkling their own spotlight isn't just due to the new espresso machines they fly in on. You can see here that the end of the game does this same thing, loading in each Inkling one at a time. Presumably weapons in the same class will play the same animation, and in the older games it's a little bit jarring to see your team all moving completely in sync. This new method helps mask that, and makes the whole experience more visually appealing. I really love this entire ending animation by the way. These poses are all really great, although it seems this game will continue the trend of being completely unapologetic about clipping. texture on the splats in the background here is really awesome too. It's a simple touch, but I love how it looks. Also note how the yellow color here is physically above the purple color, symbolizing their victory. Going back to the start of the match, these espresso machines move a lot in such a small amount of time. They fly in and then quickly spin around, shooting the Inkling into the air. That spin really helps add momentum, as you can see the energy being transferred into launching the Inkling upwards. They then quickly spin back around so the Inkling can land on the top side. Here's a super cool detail though. Every weapon class has their own unique animations at the start of a match now, but the slosher animation specifically is really great. The Inkling throws their weapon down onto the machine, causing it to spin. The slosher then bounces back like a basketball, and the Inkling catches it before landing. Really fantastic little animation here. When the Inklings land, the machines fall a little bit, giving them more believability and helping us understand how much resistance they have. And in usual Splatoon fashion, it's great to see all the ink here, in this case falling down to the ground below. As for the espresso machines themselves, there doesn't seem to be much to the design. It's just kind of an espresso machine with a handrail for the Inklings to grab onto, and of course the classic spawn icon on the bottom, though these are an evolution of the kettle technology used in the previous Splatoon games. There's even more differentiations in the animations here. Team 2 come into frame a little differently. It's a cool detail that snipers will grab onto the handrail as they hang from the machine. Because of this, their machines actually spin horizontally instead of spinning to shoot them upwards. After the camera cuts, it starts pretty high up before lowering itself to the player and pointing you in the direction you need to be looking. Your entire team starts by standing on their machines, and it seems your character will jump into their machine first, making it clearer to the player which one they are. As the camera continues to tilt down, the rest of your team also get ready and jump in. But interestingly, there's not much to the animation here. They just kind of shrink the models and then phase through the side of the machine. Kind of funny when you watch it in slow motion, honestly. Like, look at this tiny little guy with his little brush. That's not really what you're supposed to be focused on though. The camera clearly points you towards the icons, showing where you're going to land. Yours will stand out to you as it's in your team color, and there's a large circle around it, while everyone else's is grayed out. The circle actually has a useful function, at least I think. The landing icon itself needs to always be visible, so it's always the same size and always in front of other objects. It's hard to be sure in this short footage, but I think the circle shrinks and grows to communicate distance, making it a little easier to understand what you're looking at. Let's quickly appreciate the nice animation here on the word ready. Okay, moving into the HUD here, there's a couple of odd things I'd like to point out first. Your special charge meter loads in one frame after the camera cuts, but all the other elements fade in later. The squid and octopus icons at the top also grow a little bit, which is a nice touch. The layer behind your special charge also fades in well after the front of it has loaded, and weirdly, the icon for your sub-weapon doesn't fade in at all, it just pops into existence. It's likely there's some extra polish needed here. Now, as for how the HUD actually looks, I like the new 2D artwork for the weapons. In Splatoon 2, there's 3D renders of the weapons being used, but your special and sub-weapon are represented with 2D art, which I always found to be a strange inconsistency. The player icons glow a little bit too, which I think looks really good. Also, this time your sub-weapon is represented with a silhouette made of basic shapes. The charge meter is divided into segments now, potentially making it easier to understand how much charge you have and how much more you need. Functionally, it's very similar to Splatoon 2 so far, although you can see the timer isn't backed with a splat graphic anymore. The new look is a little bit neater, and I think I prefer it. Splatoon 1's HUD is kind of rough in hindsight. More space is used to convey less, although it seems this will continue to be the only game that gives you information on your gear during the match. Getting into what's really new though, Splatoon 3 makes it much clearer when a player has died, with this huge X animation encroaching into your gameplay space a little. It's just enough to grab your attention and make you aware without being too distracting. An X also appears on the stage itself to show you someone has died and where it happened, most importantly telling you this information about your own team. Unlike previous games, these X icons will stick to the side of your screen, so you don't need to be looking directly at them. You can see here the X icon alerts the player that their teammate has been splattered above them, allowing for much easier game awareness. The icons for enemies that you or your team have splattered is separated as well. This isn't new, but overall I think this game makes it a lot clearer who's being killed and where this is happening. The splatted notification that comes in has a lot more texture now than it used to as well, which I really like. I love the 2D animation effects in this game. The biggest and most obvious one is here when you charge your special, and you can also see this when your attack hits, or when you walk into enemy ink. 2D effects in 3D animation is something I really love, and I'm so glad it's becoming more common in media. This shot from Lupin III the First is a great example of just how far this can go and how good it can look. These effects are very similar to previous games though, I just like them a lot. I got a bit distracted there, but going back to the start of this match, it's interesting how the camera sinks below the espresso machines here. They then just kind of pop out of existence. It's a little bit weird when you pay attention to it, but in gameplay it does a good job transitioning the player from one point of focus to another. When you get shot out, there's a huge burst of ink and light. The word go loading in here is hidden by one of these flashes, and I really love the way it melts and then smoothly turns into speed lines as you fly towards the stage. Really cool. When these inklings land, they start glowing a little and they're covered with ink for longer than you'd expect. Presumably this is respawn invincibility, and they're using effects similar to the old Ink Armor special to communicate this. The spectator then switches the camera from one character to another, and there's some more polish issues here, with icons loading in at seemingly random times. The sniper icon takes the longest to load for some reason, then the special, and then the sub. To be clear though, this doesn't matter, I just think it's interesting to note. This also doesn't happen when the spectator switches focus in the future. It's hard to say, but this looks like it could be the return of the Miiverse style posts, which I always felt added a lot of personality to Splatoon. It seems they also might be represented with your team color now. To cover some slightly obvious Splatoon stuff, the mostly dull backgrounds you start with are a great way to contrast the bright colourful ink. It makes it clear what is and isn't covered, and helps the players stand out as well. The opposing colours are opposite, so it really couldn't be clearer who's who, and Splatoon does a great job visually communicating to the player which team is in control of the map. And this isn't just a turf war thing either, the whole game is about map control, so it's great that the game will tell the player this intuitively, even if they don't understand the concept. By the way, when the ink is covering the ground, you can actually still sometimes see the ground below, rather than it just turning into a completely smooth surface. For example, you can see the tiles still below the ink here. I don't have time to really go into the details of the stages here, but they also explain a lot to the player intuitively, like the striped warning signs on objects that you can't climb past, and the universal rule that rough, matte surfaces can be inked, while smooth, shiny surfaces can't. This is easy to understand for the player, but doesn't limit the developer's creativity. The ink looks great and is so much fun to watch as always. I love the blasts and explosions when you shoot or are being shot at. Notice how the ink really flies off you when you come out of squid form to continue that momentum, or the little sploosh of ink when you dive into it. The ink on the sides of the screen when you're hit gives you your character's perspective of being overwhelmed by the enemy, and, while it's nothing new, is a really intuitive way to communicate health to the player without need for a specific health bar. All the weapons look great and create a strong silhouette so you always know what you're up against. This also applies to sub-weapons, and you can see here how the suction bomb flashes to indicate when it's about to explode, and actually bulges a little bit when it's ready to blow. When you splat someone, they really explode, and it's great how the player's gear falls to the ground. Both the gear and the name tag bounce off the ground before sinking away instead of just disappearing. When you're killed, like in the previous games, the camera zooms over to the person who killed you, telling you what weapon and gear they're using. This is a great way to intuitively communicate to the player what they did wrong. In Splatoon 3, this screen also shows their player tag, which adds more personality to kills. The respawn graphic also fills up with color now to communicate how long it will be until you respawn. Strangely, the camera seems to zoom up a lot more here than it used to, although this could just be a spectator thing. The texture on a lot of these graphics has also been changed. Speaking of respawning, the new espresso machine system not only helps prevent spawn camping, but here there's a strong glow in the distance to communicate to other players that someone has just respawned. This helps remove some of the guesswork that was in the older games, again helping with game awareness and understanding where everyone is. When the game ends, we get the regular tape with "game" written on it. You can see how this piece overshoots a little to make the animation smoother. This is probably the weirdest part of the trailer though. The word "game" randomly fades into "finish" and then plays an animation of the tape tearing before transitioning onto the next screen. The animation here is really great, by the way. I love how it builds up that pressure and holds for a while before tearing open. As for why the word "game" changes, this is presumably because of that animation. The Japanese version of Splatoon says "finish" at the end here, and as you can imagine, changing this entire animation must be a lot more work than simply switching the word out. So in this build at least, they went with the common English "game" translation, but switched back to the Japanese original for the animation. I have to say though, I really hope this is polished in the final release of the game, because it's really going to bug me if not. When the game ends, Judd and Lil Judd come in with a bounce and some squash and stretch. Splatoon has a pretty underwhelming clash when the team scores hit each other here, and Splatoon 2 has this cool 2D animation. In Splatoon 3, it's a huge explosion of the winning team's ink. There's a ton of effects that come into the screen here, really cool. Alright, getting into the specials, the Trizuka shot is great. You can really see the recoil throwing the Inkling's weight backwards, and I like how these cartridges are discarded and thrown to the ground. You can also see how this vent in the design is actually used, with steam coming out after each shot. You can't see much of the big bubbler animation here, but I like how it's in two parts and the top flies up. There's clearly a lot more going on with the bottom half, but it's hard to see. The ink vac looks awesome. It's great how the back jiggles a lot as it fills up with ink. The electricity effect you get when shooting the ink back is amazing, and I think the first time we've had this kind of effect in Splatoon. There's an AoE indicator before a huge explosion, super cool and really powerful. When seen from the other perspective, this effect makes it clear that you're hitting the enemy's suck, thus charging them, so don't do that. For some reason, when the player activates the zipcaster, they vanish for a few frames, which I don't really understand. The camera locks on and forces you behind the Inkling, so you can clearly see where you're aiming, and the return icon fades in as soon as you start to jump. I love how the arm grabs, wiggles, and then tenses before pulling you forwards towards that wall. When this happens, your legs become extremely stretched and weird. The ink effects really help with this impact, essentially turning you into a stretchy arrow. It all helps really show that momentum. The Inkling really winds up to throw out their arm. Making a One Piece reference here is probably too obvious, but that really is what it looks like, and I'm sure the developers are well aware of that fact. When the arm connects with a surface, it's made clear with this bright ink and an orange circle. Your special meter also works as your timer here, and on your way back the Inkling does a sick flip just to show off. Here we also get to look at what happens when you're too close to the camera. It's a tricky mix of allowing the player to see what's happening, but also know where their player model is. The Inkling turns transparent, with their ink color around the edges, basically creating an outline. This is actually known as the Fresnel effect, where essentially transparent objects get thicker as they curve away from you, and you're looking through more of it at once. We can also see here what happens when an object is too close to the camera. It's interesting how a lot of games these days make these objects dots instead of just becoming transparent. The crab tank is of course amazing. While most of the time an Inkling will do a flip to mask their new object loading in after activating a special, the crab tank is a lot bigger, so there's this huge orb of energy which then gets sucked back into the tank. And you can see some leftover energy also flying around here. The way it turns into the ball form is really cool, and there's basically no trickery here, just great design. Note how the belly armor of the crab completely lifts up and how the Inkling jumps inside. It glows red to indicate that time is running out, and then despawning is masked in basically the same way as loading in. The Killer Whale 5.1 looks awesome too. I love the animation as these lights come out and then transition into your special. They make their line of sight clear, and then these smaller circles open up, start to fade, and then it suddenly strikes. Now, the triple ink strike honestly might be the best one. The thing looks like a huge toy, but I really love that. You can see there's space for these orbs on the back, which the Inkling then grabs and throws out. You can also see in later footage that these actually open up and stick to the ground with a big sucker, wiggling around a bit. The strike animation is great, and I like how it uses the classic super jump graphic to represent that something is going to come out of the sky, just something a lot bigger than an Inkling. The lights coming down from the sky before a strike are great. It feels very apocalyptic, and it's exactly the kind of chaos I want to see in a Splatoon game. After the strike, there's also this really cool, seemingly completely unique effect that reminds me a lot of Twilight Princess. So overall, If I made a video about the Splatoon series visuals in general, I'd have an endless list of good things to say. Splatoon is stylish and colourful and amazing, and I love it. But based on what we've seen from Splatoon 3, there's really not much to make it stand out at all. Most of what I mentioned here is either almost the same or the identical assets from Splatoon 2. Reusing assets is fine, but I really hope this is an indication that Splatoon 3 will have dramatically more content and build upon Splatoon 2, rather than just being a new product to force people into buying Nintendo's awful online subscription. That said, making Splatoon 2 look better I'm sure isn't an easy task. No one optimizes games as well as Nintendo on their own hardware, but in certain modes and maps, Splatoon 2 can be really rough, and I'm not sure how much harder they could push the Switch without sacrificing performance. Again, Splatoon in general has great visuals, and I could certainly go more in depth with that. But so far Splatoon 3 isn't bringing much new to the table, and it would be nice to see a visual overhaul and new art styles tried for the next game. That said, if you like this video, let me know, and I will certainly continue with these. I do love Splatoon, so I'm going to be looking at this content anyway. We can go into the currently existing weapons and the new weapons that will come, looking more in depth into the maps and things like that. As we see more content, there'll be a lot more to say. Let me know if you like this video and if there's any other games you would really like me to look into the visuals of. If you would like to improve your art for free, you can join the Learning to Draw Discord server. And if you want to see my art before it goes up in these videos, you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram. So that's going to be it for this video. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.